it is painful, I think, to start. Engineers who are not used to thinking about these things will be frustrated that their work is being interrupted. I joined a startup. I'm excited about the product. I want to spend all my time heads down on the product. I don't want to be told to stop working on something to fix this boring thing where only 20 errors are thrown. Because why does that matter? You need engineering leaders who I think understand their teams best and the personalities on their team to guide you in this process. And I don't think there's a one size fits all solution.
This podcast is hosted by Cortex.io. We help organizations continuously improve their operational maturity and reduce developer friction so that the whole organization operates as one. Check out the link in the description to see how we've helped our customers cut their MTTR in half, double their deploy frequency, and save thousands of engineering hours with golden paths and the right guardrails. Thanks for listening to Brain Trust, a podcast for engineering leaders by engineering leaders. Hi, welcome to the Brain Trust by Cortex podcast. I'm Ganesh, co-founder and CTO at Cortex. Today, I have with me Aleks, who's a principal engineer at AWS. Aleks, great to have you on. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Hi, great to be here, and thanks for having me. So my name is Aleks Rudzitis. I'm a principal engineer at AWS. I work primarily in the cryptography space. Prior to AWS, I did a stint at Stripe as a staff engineer there, also working on infrastructure related to protecting our credit card data. And before that, I was at AWS again, still working on cryptography.
It's great to have you on. I'm very excited for this episode because one of the things that is on top of everyone's mind right now is how AI is changing software development, and we are seeing a lot of data, both our own, the recent DORA report, that along with the increase in delivery, there is an increase in incident. Like quality is degrading across the board, and one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is where do humans live in the loop today, and how do we improve quality and our ability to deliver software as an organization in today's world. And while I was doing some research on this, I came across a series of posts by you around operational excellence reviews and ops reviews, both at Amazon and Stripe. Would love to talk about that. So maybe if we can kind of kick it off with just a high level overview of like what an ops review is, why they exist, and kind of your early experience with them.
Yeah, so I spent most of my career in AWS, where there's a very strong culture of every week at the AWS level, you get everyone together in a room and you look at effectively things that have gone wrong. You look at your critical metrics, you look at how things are performing. You take the opportunity to deep dive. Generally at the company level, you can't investigate everything. You kind of do a sample to see how services are behaving against some definition of correctness. And within AWS, at least, we see kind of this structure, this meeting format replicated down the organizational tree. So you'll see it in, for example, we do the same in AWS cryptography. We have a weekly meeting. And that one, because it's a little bit smaller, we do have a chance to kind of look at everything. But again, I see it, the ops review is basically, it is two important things. It is a way for the company to communicate to its employees the importance of delivering reliable software. Secondly, it is a place that serves as sort of a backstop to things going wrong. It is a place where you will look at the graphs, you will look at the signals, you will look at incident reports, depending on, however you may do that in your company, and you will try to extract learnings from them. So it's kind of the place I see where this is the buck stops. It is easy to, ship out software that breaks, quietly fix it, and maybe no one notices besides that team. But the goal is that you want to have some process where you all get together and kind of agree on what the definition of correct is, and really figure out if we are meeting that standard we have set for ourselves.
You described the ops review as a backstop, but it sounds like is just a meeting. So how does the ops review function as a backstop? Like, what gives it the authority to maybe change things in the organization that way?
So I think that's a really important point to touch on, is that as individual contributors, it's a very difficult process to implement from the bottom up. If the company does not have a culture where the leaders care about the correct behavior of the systems. And usually that means things like, when I say that, I mean, general availability, bugs in production, other performance characteristics like latency. If the top level leadership does not care about that, I do not have a good answer for how you force that from the bottoms up. Now, you can always do that as a team, but the important thing is that in these meetings that you do generally have some person either that has the authority directly or has been delegated the authority to say, one, this performance that we saw is not unacceptable, and it is now a priority to fix this. And this might mean, an example of things you might do is you might see that the number of errors we have returned to customers the number of API calls that have failed over the last month is unacceptable. We are therefore pausing new feature development, new changes until we understand what is going on and have remediated that and feel confident moving forward. So I would say the meeting is not something that has authority on its own, but I would say it is a mechanism for that authority to be exercised by people, who do have that authority.
It's kind of like a short circuit mechanism for things that like otherwise would propagate as like, oh, we have tech debt and the tech debt is causing X, Y, and Z, and it's a product prioritization roadmap, and the usual things like that.
And I think the value is in doing it in a meeting format. So you could certainly imagine other mechanisms. For example, a CEO sends an email to his reports, who send an email to their reports, who that kind of thing. But I love almost the theater of doing it publicly, because I don't know if this is what you meant by short circuit, but it's a way to send that signal directly to the individual contributors. Because I do think, even though individual contributors do not necessarily have the authority to change the priorities when it comes to product deliverables, they do have the ability to think about what they are doing in their day-to-day work and the risks they are taking and how the trade-offs they're making are valued by the company. I think it's important for engineers, when they're writing software, to understand that reliability is important for my company, that it does matter to someone if, I'll take a very simple example. If a common mistake I'll see in kind of naive software stacks is that you'll experience a spike of 500 errors while the service is deploying, because you have this kind of old version stop, new version start problem, database flips over, something like that. And I've seen, again, in newer services where that have not established this culture, people say, yes, we fail 5% of our APIs during the deployment window, but that's fine. And then I think for those folks to understand that, no, we actually do care about that. Yes, that does count against us. Yes, our customers do notice this, influences the decisions they make and their priorities when they are developing software or thinking about the infrastructure choices they're making.
That makes sense. So kind of going back to the earlier point, it's not that the ops review itself is authority, but it sounds more like a cultural thing in a lot of ways. Like, we care about talking about these things. We care about the outcomes here, and we care about, in some ways, even like interrogating the reality of our software stack across these different dimensions. Is it possible to build this, like, if you have an organization that maybe does not have this culture of reliability from the ground up, do you think is like a chicken or the egg thing? Like, can the introduction of the ops reviews create that culture, or do you need that existing care to exist first before people will care enough to run and attend these ops reviews? If that makes sense.
I do fundamentally think that the decision has to be made by someone who has the authority to influence the technical roadmap. If it's not the CEO, maybe it is the CTO or director of engineering, whatever the title is. But then the question then is for them is, now if I am in that role and I notice, maybe I've joined a company that is still early but has not figured these things out, and I see this gap, is it possible for me to change the course of the ship so that it's become part of our culture? And I think the answer is, as long as the right people are bought into it at the top, the answer is yes. But it is painful, I think, to start, because engineers who are not used to thinking about these things will be frustrated that their work is being interrupted. Especially if it's common that I joined a startup, I'm excited about the product, I want to spend all my time heads down on the product. I don't want to be told to stop working on something because Nginx throws. Sorry, not to pick on a particular open source technology, but you know what I mean. I don't want to be interrupted to fix this boring thing where only 20 errors are thrown. Like, because why does that matter? So you kind of have to break that normalization of deviance from what we've kind of defined as or what we want to consider as acceptable, and that's going to take a while. And you need engineering leaders who I think understand how their team's best and the personalities on their team to guide you in this process. And I don't think there's a one size fits all solution that I could give you, except, you know, let's start small. Let's make the problem visible. Let's make it like, I mean, one of the most basic things is if you don't have the measurements, if you don't have the graphs, you can't see the problem, then nothing is possible. So maybe you just start with a process where you make this visible, and then you kind of start ratcheting it down and say, you know, if the performance drops below this threshold, you know, the error spike above this threshold, then we're gonna stop and look at it. I think one of the ways that is interested to me most that I read about in the Google SRE, the Site Reliability Engineering book, though I haven't had a chance to implement quite literally myself, is this concept of an error budget. And I think that makes the situation very legible to, I think, you know, a wide variety of people. That it communicated for those who may not be familiar, the idea is that over some time period, you say, we will allow this many failures of requests. And it's just like a budget. I'm allowed to spend this many dollars in a time period. And now if you start getting close to the end of your budget, you now have to change how you're doing things so that you don't burn through that budget in your time period, which generally means shifting away from new features, which may break things, and focusing again on reliability, which hopefully fixes things. And I think that's really clear because it communicates that the standard is not perfection. And I think that is the biggest risk of when you're trying to introduce this culture into an organization that is already used to shipping in a different way, is that they'll take away that, well, now the standard is perfection and perfection is not possible, and everyone just gets frustrated. Yeah, I think you have to communicate a reasonable bar, and that'll depend on what field you work on. In Stripe, it was a lot easier to say to have a really high bar because, you know, every failure is potentially someone who was not able to make a purchase. The consequences are a lot easier to grok. But, you know, if you are working on a social media website and someone has to just click refresh again to see their feed, yeah, you know, maybe you don't want people to have the perception that your app is unreliable, but, you know, the consequences are a little bit less dire.
Yeah, that makes sense. The error budget thing is interesting because you mentioned earlier that in some way, just the theater and having the meeting itself is valuable. And I was talking to somebody recently who was asking, hey, why can't we just do this async? Like, why not just create a report and we can look at the report and have this conversation? Or to the point of error budgets, like, why not just force everyone to set up SLOs and you have error budgets, and that is the equivalent of you're healthy or you're not healthy? Like, what is the purpose of the meeting versus systems like SLOs and error budgets? Yeah,
that's a really great question. And it's a piece of criticism I've heard several times while trying to implement these processes. One is, can we just do this async? The second is, this also happens to, maybe you start out doing an ops review, but you get so good at your job that you don't have any errors to talk about because everything just works, and you've become so good at your jobs, and people are like, well, why are we coming to this meeting every week? So in the spirit of this being theater, I think, so I think there's two questions here. The first one is, so why not just do it async? And this is part of the human-driven infrastructure piece that I find really interesting, because in theory that sounds good, but observationally I have found that the async process turns into an email which no one ever reads, and then the culture slowly atrophies. And whether this atrophies in a world where everything is good, or whether it atrophies in a world where everything is bad, I think both are problematic. And for better or for worse, getting everyone in a room together, even if they're on their laptops half the time looking at Slack, it is useful anecdotally. Again, I don't know have a good way to quantify this. I find people take away the message better when they are in that room where their leader is asking questions about how the service is doing, because there's something about that is harder for the human psyche to ignore than another email update. And I don't really have a better answer than that. I think there is now one way you can avoid this temptation to make it async is to, bring content that can't just be async. I do, a meeting where you are just looking at graphs where, yep, everything is okay, does become very dull. And I sympathize with the engineers who do not want to sit that. So one thing we've been experimenting with recently is, can we kind of combine this option view meeting with a learning session? So one thing we do is, because we generally do not have many issues to talk about, a good problem to have, is that we use the time to talk about things engineers care about. Like, is it a forum where, because sometimes what happens is the metrics look good, but the engineers are going through extreme heroics to make it happen. People are working super late nights, overwhelmed with tickets, or getting paged on the weekend just to keep the ship afloat. So I think giving them a forum, a way to kind of talk about their experience as being on call, is one way that can make the content a bit more dynamic, and also make it something that engineers are interested in participating in, because it's not just a voice for the leadership, it can be a voice for that engineer to their leaders as well, to say, hey, yes, I know this is great, but look, I was paged 10 times on Saturday to, put out the smoke before it turned into a fire. And that's where these good metrics are coming from. We've also used it as an opportunity just to socialize learnings, like, tell us about how you are testing. Tell us about how you are doing your local testing on your laptop before you push it into the beta environment, making your software development experience that much smoother. That's just a way, I think, to kind of still stay within the spirit of operational excellence and reliability, while, making the content a bit more valuable to engineers to kind of sit through.
That makes sense. I was talking to somebody on the podcast recently, Nathan Harvey, who runs Dora at Google, and he was mentioning that one of the recommendations they have for folks for when to review like Dora metrics is in existing forums. Like, if you already meet once every 2 weeks for your sprint retros, just tack that on as a way to start. And eventually, if it's interesting enough, it'll become its own thing. And so it sounds like maybe some variant of that. I think what you're describing is like the flip of start the ops review and then tack this on at the end. But you could potentially do it the other way around of starting to create that practice. But I think what you're talking about is also, people talk about the idea behind like motivation versus discipline, right? It's like you may not always be motivated, but you need to have the discipline. Like, even if you don't work out, just go to the gym, sit in your car, and it's fine. And so it's similar to that, is what it sounds like.
I was about to say they make almost the exact same analogy. So I found the same thing with exercise. So I like running. I can't run every day. Someday I have a cold, but maybe I can go for a walk that day. And making sure that 30 minutes is still carved out. And maybe I don't even feel well enough to leave the house, but I could do some sit-ups. Just something so that time is reserved for me, and my mind is there at least for a few minutes every day, even if it's not everything I want to be, is useful for maintaining that discipline.
And I find that, and this is, like you said, it's very anecdotal, but I find that if you do get into that forum, something tends to come up. Like, there's somebody with an interesting topic that, they want to share, and that turns into a whole conversation. And I think it's reserving that space for it. You mentioned a phrase while you were talking about the meeting, human-driven infrastructure. What does that mean? That's an interesting phrase, especially now when everything is agents. Yes. What does human-driven infrastructure mean?
So a little bit more about my background. So I graduated with both a degree in computer science, but also in informatics, which you could sort of think of analogous to information science. And in that degree, there's a focus of how humans interact with technology, not just the technology itself, but what does it mean to be a human in a technological world? And this is kind of stuck with me throughout my career. And I find this fascinating because when I come to work, I don't think of myself as a person who writes code to deliver, a feature. I think of myself as a person who works with other people to ultimately deliver a product that's hopefully valuable for even more people. And technology is just a means. So human-driven infrastructure are all these mechanisms that we build for people to ultimately be successful in this task. And the tools, the technology, the compilers, the AI harnesses are ultimately just one aspect of that. But I believe even with AI, software will remain a team sport. And I think the mechanisms that we use to accomplish these tasks as a group of people are interesting, even if our precise relationship with that underlying technology changes. Because ultimately, this is for people. Like at least as far as technology stands today, we're still building this for people, and as long as that remains true, we'll remain an essential part of the loop.
Yeah, and even if you're building for agents, it's for agents that are for people in some shape or form, and like it's eventually it stops at a person somewhere. Mm-hmm. But I think that aligns well with the idea that our ops reviews are cultural, and culture is a part of working with other people on teams and aligning on shared values and things like that, and reliability being one of those shared values. Do you see that idea of human-driven infrastructure changing? Like, has that evolved in the past year, where primary consumer of some of these things were humans in the past, and some of those things are like, I think about, for example, like platform engineering principles, like golden paths and things like that, where a lot of what we did was to make things standard and easy for people to do things in a repeated way. Maybe some of those things are changing, maybe they're not. But yeah, how do you think this idea of human-driven infrastructure is changing, if at all?
Three things I'll say. The first one is I think it has only become more critical. The faster you're shipping software, the more critical the backstop becomes to understanding where your software may be, misbehaving, or you might be kind of losing sight of the more important targets. The second piece is that has been great is like the AI tools have given us the opportunity to digest a lot more data. We see this in operational reviews, where before we would have to sort of one thing we've sometimes introduced in these forums is the opportunity for the person who was on call the previous week to talk about their most interesting tickets they worked on, or their most impactful tickets. And that doesn't scale very well, because you're limited to kind of how many tickets that person can write about or report on or summarize. And AI gives us the ability to look at a lot more tickets and synthesize a lot more data, especially when that data is, I don't know, for lack of a better term, more squishy. I think before, we could look at metric trends, but now we can kind of look at more sentiment trends, in tickets. There's just more ways to analyze that data and summarize it, and present it succinctly in a meeting. And I think the final the trend I've noticed is that I think one thing that's fascinating to me is suddenly APIs and text interfaces, because they work so well for LLMs, suddenly became a bigger focus for everybody. When before we were doing a lot of things on websites, even a lot of internal tooling might have been websites, but suddenly there's a huge demand for having an API thing, or a command line interface for something, or just some text-driven mode. And that's great for LLMs, but it's also great for people too. I think that the difference is that we're almost back to kind of to the old Unix philosophy, where we have all these tools we can tie together. And yes, maybe much of the time it's an LLM doing it, but I can also do it as a human as well. So there's actually almost more pressure to automate our infrastructure in ways that was before required, what some may call the click ops model of you go to a website and click on things. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that's just because those tools, which building an API is just a much bigger opportunity now, because it's not only going to be a few people like me who live in the terminal who are going to use it, but now everyone's LLM is going to use it too. So those are kind of some of the big changes I've seen.
Yeah, on the point of kind of exposing some of these tools that are consumable by both LLMs and humans. The other thing that I think about sometimes is, like you said earlier, the human isn't out of the loop. We're just in different parts of the loop. And, human-driven infrastructure in some ways could also be now less about, like, the task has changed, like giving people visibility into what their agents are doing, or giving them the right abilities so that they can wire their agents up in a specific way. And so I think the level of abstraction is just changing, but the concept of human-driven infrastructure and I don't think is going away for that reason.
Yeah, and I think that another space is a testing, where I think before people could justify to themselves in many cases that I will do some manual testing on this in a pre-production stage to verify that it works. With the rate of change we see in AI, that no longer becomes scalable. But writing tests has also become cheaper. Building those test harnesses that automatically test features for you has become cheaper. Even qualitative testing, where you would have maybe open something in a browser, an AI can open that and do a certain level amount of value judgment about how something is rendering and whether that looks okay. So this is a great time to want to have a high operational bar, because the same tool, the same LLMs which build all these new customer-facing features can also be used to build testing infrastructure. And that's just amazing, because if it doesn't require much extra expenditure to build super strong guardrails.
That makes sense. And kind of on that note, with the way LLMs are changing both their ability to invest in the operational bar and new classes of types of issues, is the idea of operational excellence, or the things that fall into operational excellence, changing? Like, is the scope of ops reviews different than they used to be because there are new failure modes, or is the current shape and format of those ops reviews enough to kind of capture the downstream impact?
I think the primary metrics that we've looked at least availability, latency, that doesn't change. Those are kind of the bedrock of whatever your foundation is of correct behavior for your system. That remains ultimately the same. I think where it potentially changes might be secondary metrics. So metrics that you might look into when you're trying to understand how we got to those availability metrics. Certainly and the problem here is making about a general statement is this varies a lot depending on what you're looking at. I have looked at worked in organizations where that one of the secondary metrics might be number of human interventions you have to do. Interestingly, that has become a more important metric, I think, in the age of AI, is because people are looking at it and understanding, is there now an opportunity where I could remove a human intervention and make things better, where that simply was not possible before. But I think it's actually interesting that it hasn't changed much, because I think ultimately the definition of correctness hasn't changed. It's more about your opportunity to do things about it has changed.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, Dora says this in their report as well. It's like, what's old is new, what's new is old. Like those aspects of shipping a product to customers have not changed, and especially if you assume that there's a human somewhere in the chain. Correctness is the same. Like, your product does what it says it does, and we can define that in certain ways, and we want to guarantee those things. Maybe how we got to that end state is potentially different, and LLMs wrote that code instead of a human. But I think that's absolutely right from my perspective. It ties into another series of articles you wrote a while ago regarding preventing incidents and kind of standardization of practices and principles.
Yes.
And their application for reducing incidents. Has that changed now? You mentioned one of the things that you cover in ops reviews is learnings from incidents past, and Amazon's like correction of errors concept and whatnot. Are the practices that you recommend now for preventing incidents changing because of agents, or investing in different types of verification systems, or what does that look like today?
I think the biggest thing that changes is that testing has become a lot cheaper. The ability to go and either backfill unit tests, integration tests where they didn't previously exist is a lot less labor intensive than it was. So I think one of the challenges about being in a team where you wanted to ratchet up the bar in terms of quality is you'd often start with a place where there's no testing in this code base, or very little testing. And it's always hard to be the first person on a team to decide I want to do this well because the coverage is already so poor. But now with LLMs, you can the cost to backfill that just to get to a good starting point is a lot cheaper, even if it's not perfect. An interesting development has been in the field of formal verification of software. This won't apply. This won't be of interest to a lot of people. This is kind of a level of rigor I think that I expect most folks are not really interested in. But there's a whole field of formal verification where you use these tools to, speaking a bit colloquially, almost in a mathematical sense, prove the correctness of software. And this is obviously very critical in cryptography, in certain fields like, the flight computers on airplanes and things. But applying these writing proofs in these systems, annotating your code with it, verifying that your code checks out against a proof has always been incredibly labor intensive, which is why it's rarely ever applied. And what we're starting to see is that LLMs don't get tired. They don't get bored trying to implement these. And you can now apply some of these formal verification techniques to a lot more software that wasn't possible before. And you can have these proofs that are very large that no human would have feasibly wanted to write before, but are now feasible. Now, of course, you have a problem where the LLM writes the proof. How do you know the proof is good? And I think that's not a problem that's completely solved. But I'm kind of excited for developments in this space. I think there's a lot more different types of testing that kind of didn't scale with humans before that now may scale with AI.
I think it all goes back to like even testing, for example, like there's only so much time in the day and capacity for humans to do this kind of thing. And while it has gotten easier to do this type of work, it still implies that there is somebody who cares enough to steer their Claude or whatever to go and do this kind of work. And it, again, kind of loops back to the cultural aspect of this is a thing that we care about because there's some sort of impact on the customer. So therefore, we're going to invest in this kind of verification. And so maybe this ties back into the secondary metrics piece that you mentioned, where it kind of ties into like, why is our availability the way it is? And it's because, okay, we don't have ways to verify this, and that kind of leads to testing. And I do feel like more organizations are heading down this path now because it is easier to make room for reliability earlier on in their life cycle in a way that maybe wasn't before.
And I suspect teams or companies are going to find that to move at the speed they want to with AI, these guardrails need to be in place because the unit tests are not, testing in general is not only useful for preventing an outage in production or misbehavior in production. It is a useful feedback loop for AI to prevent it from simply hallucinating the way a system works. It's not perfect, nothing ever is, but the engineers I have worked with have certainly found that having robust testing in place allows them to move faster with AI and kind of reap the benefits of investments we have made into this bringing this LLM technology to developers.
Do you find that there's more of an emphasis on reliability now? And maybe this is not applicable given that you work to organizations that reliability is one of the features in some way, but are you finding that there is more of an emphasis on maintaining reliability because we understand less of the inner workings of our code, or like where do you see like the reliability changing today, if at all?
I appreciate what you said. I believe that's correct. That generally the places where I have worked, I've had the benefit of having leaders that already put a huge value on this. I think there is certainly anxiety that AI could make this worse, or we are bringing new risks in. But I think there's also a lot of confidence that the mechanisms we have built are still ultimately the right ones to prevent catastrophe.
Do you feel like the ops review process is maybe helping ease that anxiety? Because if you have this cadence of already, hey, we're looking at our metrics are healthy, things are not breaking in unexpected ways, it's like, okay, well then, what is there to have anxiety about if things are heading in the right direction? So do you feel like that process has actually help stave off some of the anxiety that maybe organizations are feeling?
Absolutely. And I think I didn't mention this benefit of this process before. We talked about it as a way for leaders to kind of communicate their priorities as a team. But if I'm a leader, I only, I'm in meetings all day. I only have so much time in my day to think about operational excellence. And I do believe it is a channel for me, even as an engineering leader, to feel that the right things are happening, to sit there and have my engineers in my organization show to me that this is why we believe our systems are still healthy. Whether that is a purpose you want this meeting to serve will depend a lot on the tastes of the size of the organization, the preferences of your leadership, and the alternative ways they have to assuage these concerns. But I think that is certainly a possible one. And I would recommend for anyone who is looking to kind of develop similar mechanisms for their organization is to certainly speak with the leaders that will be attending these meetings to understand what their anxieties are, because this is a way for them to have content presented to them to convince them that the right protections are in place.
You touched on exactly what was going to be my last question here, which is if folks are in a place where maybe reliability hasn't always been the focus, but there is this growing unease of like anxiety and concern that maybe reliability is starting to degrade, and they want to think about ops reviews as a way to improve the current state of the world, but also ease that anxiety. Where should people start? Like, is it better to start with individual teams, do the org-wide one, start with leadership? Like, what advice do you have for people that want to put this kind of process in place?
So I think it depends on where you sit in the organization where you're going to start. I think ultimately you need the blessing of some engineering leader within your organization that has the ability to exercise the authority to drive priorities, to make improvements, and also send a message that this process is indeed going to be one of your mechanisms now. So you need that buy-in, because otherwise, like, the most motivating thing that can happen is you create this meeting and simply no one shows up to it. So you need the blessing from your leadership. I think if you can get that at the top, that's great. If you can only get that within your team, that's, within your, 2-pizza team with 10 people, that's better than nothing. And then you need to understand, I think, both what are the concerns of your leadership, what are their anxieties, what does success look like to them? Because this isn't always the same as it is for engineers. And then I think you also need to ask engineers, what do they want leaders to know about their service? Because sometimes you will hear engineers, they know where the bodies are buried. They know which parts of their systems are fragile. They know where we're kind of close to an edge. And I think it's useful to understand what their anxieties are. Because ultimately, if you're having an ops review, it is a forum, it is a space for these two sides to connect. And I think the input you solicit, the more input you get from both sides about what is valuable to them, the more likely you are to create a meeting that everyone finds productive and that, has the impact to change the trajectory, or at least, maybe if you're already doing well, just maintain the trajectory you're on.
Kind of tying that back to the first part of the conversation, like you said, maybe I'll rephrase the concept of theater and the authority. It's you want to be able to have the people in the room that can reallocate time and resources towards fixing the things that this is surfacing. And the second thing that you're describing here is like, you want to have the right discussion. Like, it's not just about looking at numbers, but it's prompting conversations, and it's a forum to tell that story from both ends. Like, these are the things that I'm worried about. This is the thing we're worried about. And digging into, like, the discussion itself is valuable because it leads to the outcomes that you want in some ways.
You used a word earlier, which I thought was incredibly valuable, and was space. And when I try to develop these mechanisms, or maybe change the mechanisms we already have, I think of it as a process of creating space. I'm not there as a kind of a sponsor or champion of these meetings to fill it with content. I am there to create a space for conversations to happen. Because, ideally you may be looking at a graph or a metric on there, but what's really interesting is the conversation that kicks off. When we look at that and go, that doesn't look right. What can we do about it? So I think it's very important to not lose the forest through the trees by creating a meeting where you're just scrolling through data. You are there to inspire, to have a conversation about it. And I think when that happens, that's when that process is really successful.
Well, Aleks, thanks for joining me on the podcast. Of course, thanks for sharing this with the world in your blog as well. I think this is very timely for folks who are grappling with the effect of AI on their own software development life cycles and degradation and reliability and things like that. So it was a pleasure having you on. Thanks for joining me.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.